some Indian agriculture, a lot of Indian horticulture too, just taking care of patches of grass or wild corn or whatever is able to come up, taking care of it and stuff, and then moving with the buffalo and maybe coming back. Temporary villages that last 6 months and stuff like that. Not inspiringly close to civilization, given that we had civilization for 5,000 years back from the Mesopotamian Valley. Anyways, these resentments were often expressed in isolated acts of defiance and violence. But when the Indians made concerted efforts to stop English expansion, when they launched widespread attacks in Virginia and Massachusetts, they precipitated unrestrained warfare that involved all colonists and Indians living together on the frontiers of North America. So, the Indians started it in a certain sense, right? The white people landed, and they were doing horrific things, robbing the Indians of food and stuff, being forced to provide land by being kicked off their farmland. The Indians are resenting it, so the Indians start all-out complete warfare to kill everybody and everything, and they attack forts and towns up and down, all the way from the north to the south end of all the settlements. And that made the English colonists into really, really war-hardened people. And we're going to learn the details of that. This is just the overview. Okay, the colonists responded with devastating punitive expeditions in the largest and most destructive of 17th century Anglo-Indian wars. The First and Second Tidewater Wars, 1622 to 32, 10-year-long war, and 1644 to 46, that was only 3 years. Bacon's Rebellion, 1675 and 76, both in Virginia, and King Philip's War, 1675 to 76, in Massachusetts. Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War were the same years. Alright, we're going to talk about Virginia first. Virginians were the first English colonists to wage war with the Indians, the first colonists to create and employ armed forces against their elusive neighbors, to protect themselves against potentially hostile Indians living in their midst, right, just in teepees up and down the way, all up and down the coast. To protect themselves against this, the men who settled at Jamestown in 1607 submitted to a succession of military governors who required all men to drill regularly, maintain fortified communities, and campaign occasionally against the natives. So you were in the army. In these earliest campaigns, the colonists developed tactics to punish the Indians and push them away from English settlements. Finding it extremely difficult to engage the Indians, the colonists concentrated on destroying their villages, crops, and stores in what they called feed fights. So we're going to go out on a feed fight. We're going to destroy their village, all their crops, and all the food that they have stored. And that's going to leave them no reason to stay here. Plus, we might attack them again. They know that, and they're going to leave. And we'll have a safer area around our village. Feed fights, together with strict military rule, helped the English survive their first years in Virginia. Now, I put question mark there. Did these strict military rule actually impede the survival of the camp? I don't know. Maybe a freer, more voluntary association by the group would have been more efficient. Maybe not. Maybe war is war. Alright, let's continue. Indians were an elusive and frustrating enemy because they sought to wage war without costly battles. Brave warriors, right? Indian braves. Bullshit. They ran and hid worse than the American colonists did fighting the British. Before Europeans arrived, Indians fought one another in relatively bloodless and ritualistic wars. Bullshit again. In these wars, the aim was to take prisoners who might be enslaved or sacrificed. It was rarely to conquer or destroy an opposing nation. Yeah, except for some of the nations, like, who was it, the Sioux, that just destroyed nation after nation after nation on their borders? And on the Black Hills of Dakota, and the U.S. government came to the Sioux and they said, we need the Black Hills, it's got gold in it, people are going to come, and what can we buy from you? The Sioux were like, no, you can't have them. So anyways, we gave them a big reservation which had not been theirs just 20 or 30 years earlier. They won it by war from other tribes, kicked other tribes out. We made a huge reservation for them that they had won by force. And we were like, well, you won it, you took them. They were not peaceful, that's nonsense. Anyways, thus the Indians attacked mainly when they had superior numbers and they could surprise their enemies, when they could conduct an ambush or a raid with a good prospect of taking prisoners. Pause there. There's some memoirs written by people who were abducted by the Indians and lived with Indians for years, and then they finally escaped or were rescued or captured back or something like that, you know. Okay, they avoided closing with an enemy of equal strength, preferring to remain at a distance, exchanging arrows and protecting themselves with wooden body armor. Remember, they're still in the Stone Age, so we could probably assume that for many, many years before the Stone Age, people were using leather and wood in a way that the evidence hasn't survived. They also relied on fortifications, ditches and palisades, walls of tree trunks and brush rising 12 feet or more above the ground to secure their towns. But most Indians, valuing lives above property, were reluctant to assault a fortification or even to defend one when threatened by a larger enemy force. If they thought they had any chance of losing, they abandoned the fort. Soon after Europeans arrived, Indians began acquiring metal tips for their arrows and matchlock muskets. Remember, they were still in the Stone Age. By the mid-17th century, Indians of both the Chesapeake and the New England would have large numbers of muskets and the skill to repair them, if not to manufacture powder. So they still had to get powder, but they did have the skill to repair some of the weapons. These weapons would make warfare more lethal, and Indians, responding to European provocations, would seek increasingly to kill the colonists and destroy their property. Even then, Indians remained wary of battle. They continued to raid and ambush their enemies and to retire into swamps and forests rather than risk casualties. But in 1614, when Indians seemed a relatively passive and poorly equipped enemy, a marriage between an English colonist and an Indian princess brought peace to Virginia and a nearly disastrous relaxation of military preparations. Right? Oh, we've reached a new era of peace with these people. The colonists stopped doing military drills, neglected their fortifications, and spread out across the Virginia countryside to plant tobacco and turn a profit. This sustained expansion of English settlement alarmed the Indians. So the Indians were like, yeah, let's have peace. Let's have a marriage between daughter and this guy. Let's have peace. And then the English are like, oh, it's peace. And they all move out into the countryside. And the Indians are like, yeah. And left the colonists now living on private plantations among the natives, vulnerable to attack. On March 1622, the Indians struck. So 1614 is when the marriage occurred. 1622, the Indians strike, bringing war to the people of Virginia, as consuming and destructive as any that would be experienced in Europe during the 30 Years' War. The Indians attacked how many small spread out settlements? On that March day, the Indians killed 347 colonists and drove the remainder into 8 crowded communities along the James River. 347 colonists. That's a very high casualty rate. During the next winter, another 500 died of malnutrition and disease. Virginia barely survived. By 1624, 2 years later, the English population was 1,275. So they had lost almost 900 people in that war. The Indian strike of 1622. Some 5,000 who had been in the colony since 1618. Only 1,275 were left. After the mass, that's, wow, what is that, 25%. 25% were left over from disease, starvation, and war. After the massacre of 1622, Virginians embarked on more than 2